All right, chapter 6, running water and groundwaters. Last chapter talking about weathering and talking about how Earth takes rock and breaks it down into smaller parts. Remember, we either have physical or chemical weathering. And then this chapter has to do with one of the most important agents that helps that weathering process and also helps aid in the next two steps of the process, which is erosion and deposition. So, chapter 6 is all about running water. We're going to be talking about streams. We're going to do a little bit of water cycle review today, and then also what happens when that water goes down beneath Earth's surface. Water is really important in our life. We could spend an entire year talking about how important it is. When you look at where we are at in particular, even though we're not located right next to Lake Superior, yes, it affects our life here. Think about the people that do live close to Lake Superior. Think about how drastically it affects the weather in those areas when they have the lake effect, especially with those lake effect snows. Start to think about the economy in the area, what we're allowed to do because of that lake. From a cultural perspective, the activities that people partake in because that large body of water is there. So when we're talking about all these things about water, sort of keep in mind that sort of like full circle importance of all of the things that water provides for us. So 6.1 is running water, lots of water cycle stuff, and then also we're going to be talking about streams and some sort of terms that we use in terms of streams. We have gone through this before, but going to talk about it again. You just can't see enough analogies to wrap your head around how little of amount of fresh water we have. It is so weird for us because we live in the land of 10,000 lakes. When you look at the picture on the left-hand side, the way left-hand one, if you look at the label on the bottom there, right, is total global water. So when you look at fresh water available, it's only this tiny part up here. Now taking that fresh water and now say how much of the fresh water do we have? Well, in glaciers and ice caps, 68.7% is frozen. You have 30.1% groundwater, and you only have 1.2% surface water. So now when we take that 1.2% and we break it down any even further, it really starts to show you how little of water we have available. If you look at the pie chart on the right-hand side here, the number jumps out to me at the top. Freshwater lakes, 0.009%. Like, that is really, really low, right? A cup analogy. 97% of the cup is full of salt or ocean water. Remember, that's not the stuff that we can do things with as humans. So when you really start to look at the fresh water that we kind of focus on here, things that we need for our life, it is such a small amount, right? Look at that little tiny drop you kind of see down here on the bottom. And here's just another kind of quick video just walking through that again for us.
Let's take a look at the distribution of Earth's water. We'll begin with everything, all of the water that exists on Earth. Now, of that 100%, a staggering 96.5% of it exists as salt water in our oceans. Only 2.5% of all the water on Earth is fresh water, and the remaining 1% is other salty water that exists in estuaries and other brackish bodies of water. But let's focus in on that 2.5% that exists as fresh water. So we'll zero in. Now remember, this is a mere 2.5% of all the water on Earth that exists as fresh water. And let's break that down and see where it exists. Of that fraction, nearly 70% is locked as solid ice in Earth's glaciers and polar ice caps. Another 30% exists trapped in the ground, accessible only through the drilling of wells. And then finally, 1.2% exists as surface fresh water. Now remember, this is 1.2% of the total 2.5% of all water. So we're already talking about a tiny, tiny fraction of Earth's water existing as easily accessible surface fresh water. But wait, we could dig into that surface water even more. So if we take that fraction of a fraction that exists as fresh water, 69% of it exists in ground ice or permafrost, currently frozen and not really accessible. An additional 20.9% is found in Earth's lakes. And then the remaining 10.1% is scattered throughout Earth's rivers, in the atmosphere as water vapor, within living things on Earth, and then in swamps and marshes and in surface soil. The point is that of all of the water that exists on Earth, a fraction of a fraction, a mere 0.03% of that water is actually accessible as fresh water on the surface. Thanks for watching.
All right, so just another way kind of looking at that. All right, water cycle. Definitely not the first time you guys have heard about the water cycle, right? So I'm not having you write everything down because I would hope to think part of this you kind of have in your brain still, but let's just remember what the water cycle is. That unending circulation of Earth's water moving through all of our ecosystems, constantly moving. And why in the heck is it moving? It is powered by the sun. So think energy of the sun, getting those molecules moving. And then we have gravity, right? If we didn't have gravity, we wouldn't have the water cycle. So it definitely gets an honorable mention here. The three parts of the water cycle that I have on here, you can see I'm not having you write them down because those definitely should be committed to memory, right? So evaporation, so think puddle outside, evaporating up into the air, liquid to a gas. How does that happen? Energy gets added to those molecules, they get moving faster, boom, go up into the air, right? So instead of kind of focusing too on the small scale when we talk about a puddle, now let's start to think about lakes and think about oceans and think about streams and rivers. So they can evaporate large amounts of water. It's going to put that water in the air, it can move by wind, and those conditions can cause the water to condense and turn into clouds. And condensation, remember, is the exact opposite of evaporation, right? Gas to a liquid. So remember, as you go up in the atmosphere, it gets cooler. When it gets cooler, it's going to condense. Remember, it needs something to condense on, and that's how our clouds form. If we get enough of that moisture to collect and the conditions are right, we can get precipitation. Water that falls back down to Earth's surface, and depending upon what the temps are like, you're going to get different types of precipitation, right? Rain, snow, sleet, hail, all depending upon temperature. So evaporation, up into the air, precipitation, or let me not skip one here, condensation, cloud formation, and the precipitation back down. So now you'll notice there's a couple extra, so we're going to talk about those because those are kind of our new ones here, but let's watch this brief video here first.
All the water on Earth today, every drop, is all the water there has ever been on the planet. Fresh water is actually millions of years old, the same water flowing in a continuous loop, falling as rain and snow from clouds to the Earth's surface, running in rivers, pooling in ponds, flowing from faucets, irrigating crops, traveling through plants, generating power, eventually evaporating into the air and condensing into clouds again.
Why is there life on Earth? And the reason there's life on Earth is because Earth has this perfect water cycle.
The water cycle. So simple, even small children understand the basics. Yet so complex, the most advanced Earth scientists, hydrologists, geologists, and biogeochemists are studying every part and process.
The water cycle is fascinating. It's something that's around us all the time, and yet we don't really understand it.
How to summarize what is known about the water cycle? With two words: flows and stores. The water cycle is a series of flows of water between various water stores or storages. Clouds in the atmosphere.
There's always a little bit of water in the atmosphere. We talk about relative humidity. It's a humid day, it's a dry day. Either way, there's water, sometimes a little, sometimes a lot.
There's a lot of water in the ocean, 70% of all the water on Earth. In the ice sheets and glaciers, 2/3 of all the fresh water on Earth. In the snowpacks atop mountains like the Sierra Nevada. In the Great Lakes. In rivers and streams. In reservoirs and watersheds. In wetlands. In the soil. In and on plants and trees rooted in the soil. And beneath the soil. In water tables and underground aquifers like the Ogallala High Plains, which runs underneath parts of 8 states from South Dakota to Texas. All this storage is temporary. Water in all its forms is always in flux and always moving. And there is a name for every kind of movement in the water cycle, starting with precipitation.
Precipitation is the process of water falling onto the surface of the earth. You can have precipitation in many forms: rain, snow, hail.
Rain is falling water in liquid form. Snow, ice, hail, and sleet are falling water in solid or frozen form. Fog and mist, falling water in gas or vapor form. Precipitation that falls directly onto the oceans becomes part of surface ocean and can be churned by wave and wind action into ocean currents. Rain and snow that falls directly on rivers and streams becomes one part of stream flow. Rain that falls onto land takes a different path to the river, as does the snow and ice that falls and collects on mountaintops when temperatures warm.
When snow melts, some of it runs through the snowpack and goes into small streams, tributaries that feed into large rivers.
What about that precipitation that falls on and over land? Some is intercepted by vegetation, plants, and trees.
Like you might imagine someone in the game of football intercepting a pass. These are raindrops trying to come to the ground, and the leaves on the tree intercept them before they hit the ground.
And the precipitation that does hit the ground, it can run off if the ground is hardscaped, covered with asphalt or concrete, or if the soil is too wet or saturated to absorb more water, like an over-soaked sponge. Otherwise, precipitation infiltrates the soil surface, percolates into the ground.
Think of it as the water percolating through your coffee grounds in the morning. Gravity continues to pull it downwards so it will move through.
Through the topsoil, into spaces between soil and rock particles, down to bedrock and further into fractures, into deep underground aquifers. Even groundwater here is moving sideways or laterally, discharging toward a river, lake, or the sea. Generally, the deeper the flow, the slower the flow.
Some of that fractured water might take a very long time, thousands to millions of years to get out.
And how does water get back out into the atmosphere? It evaporates, is turned from a liquid into a gas or vapor by the heat of the sun.
If you put a bit of water into a bowl and you set it outside on a sunny day, it's going to disappear. It's still water, it's just in the form of a gas rather than the form of a liquid.
Water evaporates from every wet surface, even from wet air. Some rain and snow evaporates into the air while falling. Water evaporates through our respiration and perspiration, and from plants through transpiration. Trans means through or across. Plant roots draw up groundwater.
And plants pull that water up through their stems into their leaves and then release it back out through evapotranspiration.
Evapotranspiration, a spelling bee-worthy term for evaporation from soil and water surfaces, plus transpiration from plants. Evaporated water molecules are tiny enough to flow into the air, mix with smoke and dirt particles in the atmosphere, cool, condense into visible masses of water vapor, clouds. Winds move clouds into colder air, water droplets collide and merge, grow bigger and heavier, until they are so heavy they fall again, as rain or snow, sleet or hail. Precipitation, collection, runoff, interception, infiltration, percolation, discharge, transpiration, evaporation, condensation. The water cycle.
So definitely should be some new terms that you heard in that video there, right? And this is probably one of them. This isn't one we kind of talk about when we're younger, infiltration. And maybe if you've heard this word before on a movie or something, right? Infiltration is when water moves into rock or soil. So think about when rain hits the ground. And I think about on different surfaces, right? And they kind of showed it there in the video too about how humans have also affected the water cycle, right? You have to include us in there now because we do things to the land that will affect the water. When that water moves down through the rock and soil, it can go to a lot of different places. It can go into a lake, it can go into streams, eventually into the oceans. But depending upon what's on the surface is going to depend upon what's it going to do when it hits a surface, right? Think about water hitting a parking lot surface versus just your lawn, right? And maybe what's your lawn like? Is it have a really steep slope to it? Is it flat? So all of those things can affect the rate of infiltration of water, but that's all infiltration is. It's just water seeping down into the ground, into rock or soil. If you have a lot of water coming down and it doesn't have time to seep into the ground or infiltrate into the ground, then it will become runoff, or it's called surface runoff. So water that moves over Earth's surface. This is definitely an area where humans have had a little bit of an impact on. When you think about how we change surfaces or we add a lot of hardscape surfaces like roads, parking lots, sidewalks, all of those sorts of things, because then the water doesn't get a chance to soak into the ground, right? So it's going to have a lot of increased impacts on that surface runoff. So surface runoff occurs when the rate of rainfall exceeds Earth's ability to absorb it. You start to see this when, the picture on the right there, lots of flooding. If you get a lot of rain in a short period of time, it doesn't have time to infiltrate into the ground, that's going to happen. Transpiration. So part of that wonderful photosynthesis process can't leave plants out of the water cycle because plants release water through those stoma on the under part of their leaf, those little openings that they have, part of the whole process of photosynthesis, and release water back into the air. They're actually a really important part of the water cycle. Our water cycle maintains Earth's overall water balance, right? Because it's a cycle, there's no beginning, there's no end. But when you look at this picture, as you can see over here, and you don't have to get into the numbers just to fully understand that the average annual precipitation is going to equal the amount of water that evaporates and transpires. And think about what that means, right? Average annual precipitation, so the amount of water coming down, is going to equal the amount of water that goes back into the air, right? Makes sense. It should be a balance. You can't create or destroy matter, so that would make sense. When water collects in certain areas because of the topography, maybe it's low-lying, maybe it has certain rock features in that area, but we can get streams that form. So stream flow affects the ability of a stream to erode and transport materials. So how much water is in a stream affects the ability of that stream to erode and transport materials. Velocity, a little bit of a refresher here, right? We've learned about velocity, very similar to speed, so distance over time. Velocity is how fast that water is moving. If we look at streams, think about a slow stream moving about 1 kilometer per hour, and a fast stream would be a lot greater, right? 30 kilometers per hour. So kind of imagine yourself, putting yourself in a kayak there, difference between the two of those if you're kind of, going along those. Now, another weird thing that you see on the picture on the right-hand side there, in terms of stream velocity, so how fast the water is going, you can see in the picture here, for picture A, along straight stretches, the stream velocity is going to be highest at the center of the channel. So if you want to be going the fastest, that's where you would go, in the middle of the channel. If a stream curves, the zone of maximum speed shifts towards the outer bank. So if you want to be going the fastest on a curved stream, it's going to be fastest on the outside, and that's an important thing to remember, because now start to think about erosion, stream erosion, how that's going to happen. On a straight stretch, if the water is going the fastest in the middle, that's where it's going to erode the most. On a curved stream, because the water is moving the fastest on the outside of the curve, that's where you're going to get the most erosion, right? It's going to cut into that outer bank the quickest or the fastest, because that's where the water is moving the fastest. So just kind of a visual here, high velocity stream in comparison to a low velocity stream. So kind of use your common sense in terms of how this would really affect the erosion of the land in those areas. When we talk about stream gradient, is the slope or steepness of a stream channel, or the course that the water flows. What we really look at is, what is the vertical drop of a stream over a certain distance? What is it at the headwaters? What is it at the end of it? So that's the stream gradient. What's the difference between where it starts and then where it ends? Obviously, a higher stream gradient is going to give us a little bit different features with a stream versus a stream that has a lower stream gradient. The channel characteristics of a stream can greatly affect the stream. What's the shape? What's the size of it? What's the roughness of the channel, which can affect the friction of the water along the bottom. So you can start to put into perspective why when you see a stream on the left, you're going to have certain characteristics versus a stream that you would see on the right there, because there's a lot of factors that play into when that water is moving, what is it moving over, and then what you're going to see because of that movement. Stream discharge, the volume of water flowing past a certain point in a given unit of time. So think about, now we're not talking about how fast the water is moving, we are talking about the amount of water that's moving, right? How much water is moving. So that is the stream's discharge. And there's some math that you can actually do. You can see it in the picture over there on the side. You're going to take the area of the stream times the velocity of the stream. So that's obviously important. If you look at the table on the right-hand side there from your book, the world's largest rivers ranked by discharge. So think about volume of water. It is the Amazon. So the Amazon's average discharge is 212,400 cubic meters per second. Cubic meters per, think about that. Think how big a meter is, right? That is a lot. When you compare it to, one of our great rivers in the United States, the Mississippi, dwarfs in comparison to that. So it sort of gives you an idea of just how large of a river and how much water that the Amazon is actually pushing. Streams that empty into another stream, we call those tributaries of them. So if you kind of look at these waterways that we see in our map there, if a stream empties into another stream, it is a tributary of it. So we would say, for example, the St. Croix River is a tributary of the Mississippi River, the Chippewa River, the Minnesota River, the Wisconsin River. All of those rivers feed into the Mississippi River. So we say they are a tributary of it. And you got it. These are the big ones, right? Think about the St. Croix River. There's streams that go into that. So we would say those are tributaries of the St. Croix. But you'll notice they all do the same thing, right? They all eventually lead to a body of water or an ocean.
The Mississippi River dumps its Mississippi juice into the ocean right here, in a delta below the city of New Orleans. But it's not actually supposed to do that. In fact, the Mississippi River should enter the ocean here and be shaped like this. The only reason it doesn't is because the US government has spent billions of dollars over several decades to make sure that it stays on this exact course. But how do they do that, and why exactly do they care so much? Well, let's zoom out a bit. This is the United States of America, which is a very large rock that has lots of bears on it, and this is the Mississippi River, which is a river. Ever since there were people on this continent who wanted to move stuff, this river was important. For thousands of years, it served as America's wet, primordial highway system, being one of the most efficient ways of moving people and cargo in, out, and around the greatest country in the United States. It became particularly useful during the Industrial Revolution, when Americans had bigger things to move and bigger ships to move them, but there was a bit of a problem. The Mississippi River was not designed to turn the cogs of capitalism. It was only designed to make water go whoosh. The real trouble was right here, on the border of Mississippi and Louisiana. When America was first settled by indigenous populations, the Mississippi flowed more or less straight into the ocean, but as time wore on and the river got older, it also, like all of us, got a little curvier, and one such curve was this, Turnbull's Bend, where the Mississippi cut across to intersect with the nearby Red River. This detour took hours to navigate, and mathematicians at the time had just discovered that time equals money, so a river engineer by the name of Henry Shrepp said, hey, let's just dig a channel straight from here to here. I bet that won't cause any massive logistical problems in the future. I don't even know why I'm saying that. Why are you writing all this down? Just go dig the stupid channel already. So, in 1831, they went ahead and dug a channel, which was great because they could move crates of pecans slightly faster, but was bad because the river started to slowly and irreversibly change shape in a way that would devastate the US economy and potentially kill tens of thousands of people. But hey, everyone makes mistakes, and I'd be lying if I said I'd never accidentally caused an ecological catastrophe by digging a canal in Louisiana without considering its long-term effects. So, let's talk about what exactly the problem is and how the government has scrambled to keep it under control. You see, when the canal was dug, this part of the river pretty much dried up, and the flow from the Mississippi into the Red River created a shiny new river called the Atchafalaya. Great, everyone loves a new river, but the problem was that this river naturally has a much shorter and steeper path to the Gulf of Mexico, and over time, more and more of the Mississippi started to flow this way instead of this way. By the 1950s, the government realized that if they didn't do something, the Mississippi would completely change course and divert into the Atchafalaya, which both sounds bad and is bad. Problem number 1, all the ports from here to here, including the major cargo ports of Baton Rouge and New Orleans, stop working. No more water means no more ports means no more exporting soybeans, and no more exporting soybeans means, I don't know, a whole bunch of people lose a whole bunch of money? Problem number 2, all 1.5 million people living in this general area no longer have drinking water. While it might not be immediately clear why this is a problem, studies have shown that people need to drink water to live, and from this we can conclude that cutting off the water supply for Louisiana's 2 largest cities would be a bad thing. Problem number 3, while it sure seems like the people around here enjoy the water from the Mississippi River, that doesn't necessarily mean that water would be welcome over here. In fact, most of Morgan City and Berwick would end up pretty much destroyed in the process. Okay, so assuming you're in the pro-drinking water and anti-Morgan City being destroyed in a devastating flood, I've probably convinced you that it would be bad if the Mississippi changed course. So how exactly have we stopped it from doing that? Well, in the early 1960s, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers went ahead and constructed something called the Old River Control Structure right here, where Turnbull's Bend used to be. In order to control the flow of the Mississippi into the Atchafalaya, they slapped a navigation lock down here and a floodgate up here. The floodgate maintains a flow of 30% this way and 70% this way to match the flow of the river when the structure was originally built, thus preventing it from, doing the bad thing. They later added a second floodgate here to reduce the impact on the first floodgate, and a hydropower plant here so that this whole thing feels like it actually does something besides waste billions of dollars undoing a decision that some guy made 200 years ago before they had invented the concept of consequences. But hey, you know what else has catastrophic consequences? Not eating right. If you're a busy person like I am, you might know that maintaining a healthy diet while juggling the rest of your life is a struggle. But with Factor, it doesn't have to be. Factor is a weekly meal prep service that delivers fresh, healthy, ready-to-eat meals straight to your doorstep. Every single week, you get to choose from 35 different meals, each designed and prepared by registered dietitians and chefs working hand in hand to make sure everything is both nutritious and delicious. And no matter what your lifestyle is, Factor will have a meal plan that works for you, like keto, calorie smart, chef's choice, or vegan and veggie. Factor is owned by HelloFresh, which I've used for years, so when I learned that they had a pre-prepared meal service, I had to try it out, and it turns out I genuinely love it. If you don't believe me, this is what I literally had for dinner the night I recorded this video. Factor's cheesy bacon ranch shredded chicken. It only took minutes to heat up, and yeah, it rocked. Like, you probably think this tastes similar to a prepared meal from a grocery store, but it is so much more delicious and flavorful since they're freshly prepared and never frozen. Even though I'm away from home a lot, Factor's flexible scheduling makes it easy for me to get meals when I want them, and to skip weeks when I'm gone. So if you want to start eating healthy without the hassle of meal prep, I can't recommend Factor enough. Just head to factor75.com and use...
Okay. One of the nice things I like about that video is that reinforced discussion of our effects of humans. It's sort of bizarre when you think we could actually do something as, monumental as affect where the Mississippi River discharges into the ocean, right? All right, so changes from upstream to downstream. When the gradient decreases, so think of that, it's not as steep between a stream's headwater and its mouth, the discharge increases, so the volume of water increases as you move downstream because of added volume of water from tributaries. So as it moves and it moves and it moves, it's getting more water, it's getting more water, and it's getting more water. So that means as it's picking up more, it's going to have more discharge. So greater discharge down here than up here. The base level of the stream is the lowest point to which a stream can erode to its channel, the level at which the mouth of a stream enters the ocean, a lake, or another stream. So the ultimate base level is at sea level, right? Makes sense. The lowest level the stream erosion can lower to the land. It's not going to go deeper than that, right? That wouldn't make sense. We do also use the phrase local base level, so that would include lakes, resistant layers of rocks, and main streams that act as tributaries. So the ultimate would be where the be-all, end-all, the end part of it is, but the local is any local location. What would the lowest part be that stream would go to? So if we look at this picture here, base level, absolute base level would be sea level over here, but local base level, the lowest spot that stream would go to would be in this other spot. When we look at streams, depending upon their age, we'll put in quotes. They're not alive, right? But we'll use the term age. We can sometimes see these really cool features. It's called a meander. So as streams get older, they meander more. It's just a loop-like bend in the course of a stream. And then what ends up happening, we'll learn about these later on, eventually they get cut off and form these really cool things called oxbow lakes. So downcutting, the stream erodes its channel and deepens it over time. So that's why we see these meanders in older streams. So the curve is the actual meander. And then downcutting, can't talk about this. So this one happened without just mentioning, when you look at the Colorado River, you look at Grand Canyon, all those cool things. It is crazy to think when you look at those features that was literally created by downcutting of a river over millions of years. So water is a really important agent on Earth, and it has a lot to do with erosion.